In the previous episode, it was mentioned that Daryl and Carol successfully escaped from the nest, but they did not find Laurent in the cave. They had no choice but to follow the trail and keep moving forward. Daryl and Carol haven't seen each other for a long time and have endless things to talk about. They finally remembered the last phone call.
Just gathering up some fuel. I'll be there in about a week. I promise.
Yeah. Hey, Daryl.
Yeah.
Came back.
Who came back?
Although it wasn't the message Daryl most wanted to hear, the search had already become a part of his life. But now, he had to quickly find Laurent and Falou, because the tracks on the ground showed that someone had caught up to them. As night fell, the village ahead appeared especially eerie. On the side of the road, various zombies were bound and continuously emitting terrifying growls. Daryl took the lead, carefully steering around these contraptions, while Carol cautiously followed behind. They weren't scared, but the atmosphere felt too strange. They had no idea who had set up these frightening traps, so they decided to proceed with caution. Soon, Daryl and Carol arrived at a small yard at the end of the path. Strangely, the gate was wide open, and even the house was easily accessible. Daryl didn't dare let his guard down, as there were too many strange people in the post-apocalyptic world, and this could be another trap. He raised his shotgun, vigilantly scanning the surroundings. The room was tidy, indicating that someone was still living there. They decided to continue into the house and turned down a hallway that led to the stairs going down. Sure enough, there was a room downstairs with lights on. Daryl immediately turned to Carol, signaling her to be ready and cooperate.
Monsieur Dixon?
Carol looked at Daryl, puzzled, but Daryl didn't know what was going on either. The elderly couple at the dining table introduced themselves and then told Daryl that Laurent had explained in advance that they would be coming here soon. Upon hearing this, Daryl lowered his guard. 5 minutes later, 2 more servings of food were added to the table, and the elderly couple warmly invited them to eat. Daryl and Carol finally enjoyed a hearty meal. Carol expressed her gratitude, praising the food as delicious. At that moment, Theo began to explain what had happened earlier. He had encountered Falou and Laurent while out, and seeing that they were cold and hungry, he offered them help. Daryl was naturally pleased to hear that Falou and Laurent were safe.
They left on foot?
To Paris?
Yeah.
No, I'll find them a car.
Can you find us a car?
I have many here. Maybe you can make one to work.
Just as Daryl was about to speak, Carol interrupted him. She knew what he was thinking, but it was too dark outside. Daryl immediately understood her hint and dropped the idea of going out. Seeing this, Dee quickly intervened, telling Daryl and Isabel to rest and take it easy for now. Carol gave an awkward smile but didn't plan to clarify her identity. Daryl couldn't help but chuckle. The next day, Daryl followed Theo to the garage and indeed found several cars, though they had signs of being refurbished. It was clear they hadn't been used in a long time. Having fuel would make things much easier. Daryl walked over to the last car and found that it was in decent condition, but still needed a few parts replaced. Theo thought of a place where they might be able to find the parts, but he needed to go back and grab some tools first. Daryl had no objections and was prepared to go back with Theo. Meanwhile, Carol and Dee were preparing lunch. The two women chatted about everyday trivialities. Dee was very fond of Laurent, constantly talking about him. Carol smiled knowingly.
Why do I get the feeling you're trying to tell me something?
Laurent thinks that Daryl loves you but won't say it because if he says it, he won't be able to leave.
Now she understood Daryl's little secret. No wonder he always got anxious whenever the topic of going home came up. It turns out, Daryl doesn't want to leave because he's reluctant to part with certain people. Dee still treated Carol as Isabel and shared many things directly with her. Carol decided to go with the flow and continued the conversation about Dee's family matters. To her surprise, Dee had a very open-minded attitude towards marriage. She and Theo weren't actually married. They only started living together a few years ago. Her own family had all passed away. At that moment, Theo and Daryl returned. As soon as they met, Theo and the elderly couple warmly began dancing. The onlookers, Daryl and Carol, glanced at each other. So this is the kind of romance that's in the French genes. Half an hour later, Daryl and the group set off to find the parts. Compared to the previous night, the village during the day felt much calmer, but the eerie atmosphere still lingered. Every house had zombies locked up in the yards. Theo, with complete ease, even waved hello to the zombies. From his description, it seems that this state of coexistence has been going on for a long time.
Old people burying old people, too hard. So when someone dies, we lock the gate and pay respect when we pass by.
Although Theo had a point, Daryl and Carol still found it strange. No sane person would keep danger so close. After all, many accidents happen just like that. Fortunately, they had reached their destination. Theo jumped off the cart and walked toward a small yard. Before entering, he specifically told Daryl and Carol to wait there. Daryl, as usual, kept an eye on the surroundings. Carol took the opportunity to ask him about Laurent. She suggested that if Daryl wanted, the boy could probably integrate well into the Federation. To Carol's surprise, Daryl denied it. He felt Laurent would be better off staying in Paris, where there were familiar surroundings and friends.
Maybe I don't want that.
What about the kids back home?
This is different.
Is it?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I don't want to lose him.
You end up like me? Is that what you're afraid of?
Daryl was stunned. He hadn't expected Carol to see right through him, but he still insisted that he wasn't afraid. Carol sighed helplessly. Daryl's concern for Laurent was so obvious, and she didn't know what Daryl was being stubborn about. Just then, Theo finally came out and called Daryl and Carol into the house. They arrived at the garage, where a well-maintained vintage car was parked. Daryl lifted the hood and saw that it indeed had the parts he needed. The car's owner, who stood on the other side, was friendly enough. After a few casual words, he walked away. Daryl didn't waste any time. After thanking the man, he began to dismantle the parts. Half an hour later, Daryl and Carol returned to Theo's house with the parts and immediately started working on the car. Dee brought them afternoon tea and suggested that she and Carol go to get some ethanol fuel. The two of them headed toward a nearby barn, but Carol suddenly stopped in her tracks. That nightmare returned, the growls of zombies mixed with the sound of a woman crying. Dee noticed that something was off with Carol and cautiously asked her what was wrong. Carol only said she had a little daughter, and Dee immediately understood everything. She stepped forward and slowly embraced Carol. They had shared similar experiences and could truly understand each other's emotions. Dee had come to terms with these things, and now she wanted to help Carol find some peace. 1 hour later, Daryl was still working on the car. Carol returned to the driver's seat to help with the gas pedal, but their coordination was a bit off. At that moment, a military vehicle approached from the distance. The group immediately tensed and went on high alert at the sound. Theo spoke up, telling Daryl and Carol to hide in the car, because the approaching vehicle belonged to Janet's soldiers. The military vehicle quickly came to a stop in the open area, and a soldier stepped out, walking straight up to Theo. Inside the car, Daryl and Carol were on edge, afraid that the soldiers might suddenly take action, but it seemed like they were just arguing with each other. At that moment, Dee walked over with 2 baskets of food. The soldier immediately reached out to take them and placed them in the back of the vehicle. The soldier's attitude was far from polite. He seemed to be accustomed to doing this sort of thing. Soon, the soldiers drove off. The elderly couple had long harbored resentment towards the soldiers, so they refrained from revealing Daryl and Carol's location. It was clear that this place was no longer safe. Daryl and Carol worked quickly to repair the car, but as the sky grew darker, they realized they would have to stay the night. Daryl and Carol discussed their next move. It was obvious that Janet had won this battle, and they would soon be surrounded. But Daryl had been avoiding the topic of going home, so Carol wanted to know his true feelings. She handed Daryl a small gift from Judith, a knight with wings.
How is she?
She didn't want me to go. Part of her knew I had to if there was a chance I could find you. I guess I'm just surprised you got so close to people here.
I didn't mean to. It's hard to explain, I guess.
Carol, very understanding, said that if he ever wanted to talk, he could come to her anytime. Once the misunderstanding was cleared, their small friction from earlier in the day was put behind them. Early the next morning, Daryl and Carol began packing their things in preparation to leave. Theo hurried over to stop them, saying that breakfast was ready at the house, just as a way to bid them farewell. At his earnest invitation, Daryl and Carol reluctantly agreed. They planned to quickly eat breakfast and then say their goodbyes.
And for all you've done.
What are your plans? After you find Laurent, will you stay in Paris?
Oh no, we're still working it out.
After Daryl answered Dee's question, the atmosphere immediately fell silent. Daryl quickly finished his food. Suddenly, the roar of a car engine came from outside. Daryl immediately stood up to check, and once again, it was the same soldiers from the day before. Carol sensed something was wrong and turned to look. Theo had already drawn his gun and was pointing it at them. The betrayal came so suddenly that even Dee Dee couldn't react in time. She questioned Theo, asking why he was doing this, but Theo explained that they were getting old, and living in a village full of zombies made it hard to survive their later years. Only by siding with the victors could they secure a chance at survival. Dee Dee was disgusted by Theo's actions.
Come with me. Vieux fou.
She immediately led Daryl and Carol to find a way out. However, Daryl and Carol tried to sneak away but realized it was too late. Janet and her elite team were already outside, blocking the exit. They had their guns ready and were preparing to search the area. Daryl grabbed a weapon and, following Dee Dee's instructions, slipped into one of the rooms to hide. Just then, Janet pushed the door open and walked in. Dee Dee naturally closed the door behind him and politely greeted Janet. She told her that Daryl and the others had left after breakfast. They had tried to delay them as much as possible, but Daryl and his group were too suspicious and insisted on leaving. Janet nodded when she heard this. This was indeed the way those two people acted. Meanwhile, Daryl and Carol had made their way around to the other side of the house. There was a window in this room that allowed them to observe the soldiers outside.
Here, cover me. We'll get the car.
Carol immediately became alert, carefully watching every movement outside the window. On the other side, Janet leisurely walked around the room and then pointed to the dining table, asking if she could have something to eat. Theo quickly went over and prepared new utensils for Janet, then returned to his previous position. He was filled with unease. His plan to betray Daryl had failed, and now he had to cover for them instead. As Janet ate, he complimented their cooking skills. While Janet and the Theo couple chatted casually inside, Daryl quietly slipped into the garage. He waved to Carol, signaling her to follow. Carol, seeing this, immediately turned and walked away. As she crouched down to pass a window, she overheard the conversation inside.
C'est l'ennemi, en vérité. Nous sommes en guerre. Vous savez qui je suis?
Oui, j'ai entendu parler de vous. Par mon père.
Janet was a little surprised to hear this, because Dee Dee's age meant that her father would be quite old, but Dee Dee answered that her father had died during World War II, but she could instinctively recognize the signs of a dictator's rule. Janet's expression immediately darkened. This old woman had dared to insult her to her face. Meanwhile, Daryl quietly opened the car door, hoping to grab the weapons from the back seat. Just then, a soldier suddenly walked toward the garage. Daryl had no choice but to stop what he was doing, retreating to hide behind a nearby wall and waiting for an opportunity. Carol had just poked her head out when Daryl quickly gestured for her to stay back. Carol retreated back, but then she heard voices coming from inside the house. Theo tried to urge Dee Dee not to provoke them, but Dee Dee shot him a look and insisted that Daryl and the others had already left. Janet immediately countered, asking why the food on the table was still warm. As soon as Janet spoke, everyone tensed up. Theo and Dee Dee were so nervous they couldn't even look at her.
Ils sont là quelque part.
On va fouiller la maison.
Non. Qu'ils le fassent, eux. S'il y a bien une chose dont les morts sont capables, c'est flairer les vivants.
As soon as the words were spoken, the soldier began loading the injection gun with ampoule serum. She was preparing to turn the elderly couple into mutated zombies to help track down Daryl and Carol. The soldier nearby was about to make a move when suddenly... The soldiers outside heard the gunshot and rushed toward the sound. Daryl immediately struck the metal box to create a noise, hoping to draw the soldiers' attention and help divert the focus from Carol. Sure enough, the soldiers moved toward the sound. On the other side, Carol opened the door and stepped in. She instantly took down the soldier in front of her, then carefully stepped around the elderly couple embracing on the floor and made her way toward the back staircase. On the second floor, Carol is on guard with her shotgun, searching for any sign of Janet through the crack in the door, but apart from the open door, she saw no one. Suddenly, there was a slight sound of movement. Carol immediately fired 2 shots at the door frame, then quickly ducked to the side, waiting for the counterattack. The enemy's bullets did come, but Carol's shotgun was out of ammo. She was about to retreat the way she came, but the soldiers had already blocked the door, and the door behind her was kicked open. Janet, holding a gun, walked into the room. Now, Carol had nowhere left to escape. Janet slowly lowered her handgun, and she began to speak about how the apocalypse had destroyed everything she once had. The once glorious Paris had fallen into darkness. The rich fled to villas or castles. The powerful took boats to escape, while ordinary people were left to survive in the broken streets. Barely hanging on, Carol could understand Janet's feelings, but she despised the ruthless, authoritarian methods Janet had adopted. Janet thought Carol would still understand her, but now, it seemed that wasn't the case. At Janet's signal, the soldiers raised their guns. Suddenly, the situation turned around too quickly. Janet showed a rare moment of fear. Carol, grabbing a weapon she had picked up, aimed and fired at Janet. To Carol's surprise, Janet didn't die. Instead, she frantically tried to pull out a syringe. It was then that Carol realized the gun had been loaded with a mutation serum. Although it wasn't her intention, in this situation, she could only watch and see what would happen next. Daryl, still on the other side, was extremely cautious. He had never seen someone injected with the mutation serum, and he wasn't sure what the consequences would be. Janet struggled in despair. She unexpectedly saw her grotesque reflection in a mirror. In the next moment, her consciousness began to crumble, and she collapsed, convulsing violently on the floor. Carol and Daryl watched in shock as Janet writhed and then lay still, dying from the effects of the zombie serum. After a moment of stunned silence, they both let out a small sigh of relief. Carol got to her feet, waiting for Daryl to come over and join her. Janet paid the price for her own malicious actions, dying from her own ampere serum. A minute later, Carol pushed open the door to the dining room and saw Theo holding Dee Dee in his arms, crying. She quickly walked over to check, but Dee Dee had been badly shot and was already dead. Theo was filled with regret, but he knew it was too late now. His betrayal ultimately hurt the one he loved. By the afternoon, they had buried Dee Dee together, and Theo knelt beside the grave, repenting, but the kind and upright Dee Dee never forgave Theo until the end. Daryl placed the shovel aside and then turned to follow Carol as they left. That night, Daryl and Carol packed up their belongings again, preparing to leave. Carol found a map and started planning their route ahead of time. Daryl walked over and leaned against the car, telling her about his experiences in France. At first, he hadn't had much affection for Isabel. Their relationship had been more of a mutual benefit. Later, they reached an agreement to escort Laurent, and Laurent became the glue that held them together. After many accidents and adventures, Daryl and Isabel slowly realized they cared for each other. Carol nodded in understanding. Daryl smiled and silently agreed.
Stop trying to get home to you. The longer I stayed here, the harder it got.
You left her.
Today's events had made him realize a lot of things. He didn't want to hide anything from his family anymore, so he directly told Carol that he wanted to take Laurent back to the United States. Carol smiled and said she understood, and they both got into the car to leave. At the Union of Hope headquarters, Losang and Jacinta received some good news. Janet had been killed by Daryl and Carol, but Losang's train of thought was strangely unconventional.
Marine's way was not enough. But neither is yours.
Jacinta, ever sharp, could tell that Sabine's words had an underlying meaning. She quickly asked, "What do we do next?" Dr. Lafleur looked at Sabine. Both of them had been loyal subordinates of Janet. Now, with the leader gone, they had no one suitable to follow, and could only resort to this last option. Half an hour later, Losang walked into the hall with a radiant look on his face. He stepped to the front of the crowd, and the noisy group quickly fell silent.
All is forgiven. My friends, tout est pardonné.
Seeing the puzzled faces of the people, Losang spoke again. "The war is over. Janet's army will join our family. We will unite our dreams, merge our ideas, and build a stronger, better future together. And as I promised, Laurent will lead us to immunity from the virus. From now on, no one will have to fear zombies anymore."
Allons trouver l'enfant.
The next day, Fallou was discussing post-war reconstruction with Nadine. Nadine said that the people in the camp were all in a state of panic, not knowing what had happened at the nest. Fallou explained, "Leader Losang has lost his mind and misled many people, like Emile, but we must hold fast to our faith and keep surviving." Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and they immediately became alert. The gates slowly lifted, and a figure suddenly collapsed to the ground. Fallou and the others approached and saw a figure wearing a hat, their head lowered, making it impossible to see their face. Fallu dragged Codron with him into the camp. Furious that this man had caused so much harm to them yet still dared to return, Fallu forcefully pushed Codron to the ground, demanding to know what his intentions were. People from the camp gathered around, and Laurent stood high up, watching the scene. Everyone looked up when Laurent spoke, explaining, "This man had the chance to kill me, but he stopped his teammates and even let us go." Everyone was shocked to hear this. Codron, relieved, explained his reasons for coming. "I just escaped from the nest. Janet has taken control of leader Lawson," he said.
Tant mieux, c'est ce qu'il mérite.
Mais alors? Et Daryl?
Codron answered that he had also been captured by Janet and didn't know the situation of the others. However, there was an American woman who had rescued him, and she was also looking for Daryl. Laurent thought for a moment and asked,
Est-ce qu'elle s'appelle Carole?
"Will Carol and Daryl successfully find Laurent? What action will Lawson take next?" Stay tuned for the exciting developments in the next episode.